Okay, so this video is the next step in working with the trig problem. So our first video talked about what the trig ratios were and how to determine what the ratios were, the SOHCAHTOA piece of it. The second video, the last video you just watched, was on evaluating trig ratios, putting them in our calculator, and then using the inverse trig ratios to find angle measures. Okay. Today we're going to do that next step, and we're going to set up the trig problems. Now we're not going to solve anything, but we're going to look at how to set up the problems. So then in our next video, next class, we will learn, we'll kind of tie it all together. We'll put all the pieces together, we'll do the setup, what we did with the evaluation piece, all of that, and then we'll actually solve some problems. Okay? So when we're setting these up, I have two things I need you to recall. For trig problems, you need to have one angle and two sides. Okay? And SOHCAHTOA here tells us, I'm going to write it a little differently. I write it like this on my paper when I'm doing my work because it helps me see the ratios, what they go with. Okay? Those relate to this one angle and two sides idea. So I'm going to draw three triangles. And in order to do trig, they have to be right triangles, so I've marked them. And I'm just going to pick this angle. I'm going to call it X in all of our problems. It doesn't have to be that one. I could use this top one up here, but you're only going to have one angle. Okay, one angle in our trig problems that we're going to be dealing with. And I've picked that one just for the sake of the drawings. Now I'm going to show you that sine. Okay, what I'm looking for is that I would have to have the opposite side, the one over on the other side, and the hypotenuse. Those would be my other two sides to my triangle, the two parts. And that would help me recognize that this is what a sine function would look like. I'd use that function. If I wanted to use cosine, I'd have to have the adjacent one to the angle, the one right next to it, and the hypotenuse, where the right angle's pointing. That's what my triangle would look like. If I wanted to do tangent, it would be the opposite and the adjacent. No hypotenuse at all. Okay? So those are the three things we're looking for, because the first thing we have to do in these problems is identify what we have. Okay? This is step one in relation to that angle. What I typically do is I circle the angle in the triangle, so I know that's where I'm starting from, what I'm looking at. Everything's based off that angle. And then I label the other two sides I have with an O, an A, or an H. Once I've done that, step two is to determine the trig function. So we're going to look and see which of these three triangles we have. Did they give us an O and an H so that we'd use sine? Did they give us an A and an H so that we use cosine, or did they give us the opposite and the adjacent, the O and the A, so that we use tangent? Okay, that's the next step. So step one, label what you have. Step two, use that label in order to determine your trig function. Step three is then to write the equation, and this is as far as we're going to go with it today. We're just going to write the equation, and you always write it in this form. You do your trig function, which is sine, cosine, or tangent, then the angle from the triangle, which is what you circled, and then you write out your ratio as a fraction. That's the O over the H if we used sine, or the A over the H if we used cosine, or the O over the A if we used tangent. Okay? You would write whatever corresponds to the trig function you're using. And that's it for today. That's how we're going to set them up, and that's where we stop. We're just setting up the problems. I have 6 examples to work through. Okay, all of them have a variable in there because where we're going with this is we're going to be solving for that variable. We're going to determine the missing part. Okay, so here's our first one. I'm going to walk through the steps with you. Step 1 was to label what we have. So we circle the angle, and then we look at what they've given us and label it O, A, or H dependent on where it's located. Well, I see that that right angle is pointing over here to this side. That tells me that that's the hypotenuse, and I don't have anything there. So I know that this isn't going to be tangent. The X here is the one opposite of the 55, and the 8 is adjacent to it. So I have O and A. Okay? So I know that I'm going to use tangent here. Okay? Does that make sense? Hopefully, because we used the SOHCAHTOA TOA piece. Thinking back, I may have misspoke. I said this wasn't tangent. It is tangent because we have O and A. It can't be sine or cosine because we don't have the hypotenuse. Okay? Have the O and the A, we're going to use tangent. Now we're going to write out our equation. We do the trig function first, and then we use the angle. So 55, what we circled, equals, and now I put my ratio, which is the opposite over the adjacent, or the x, which is on the O, over the 8, which is on the A. And that's what we're going to write. Okay? In Schoology, it's set up just like this. You will type in your trig function, type in your angle, type in your ratio. Now do not simplify that ratio. Okay? It's going to save us some trouble towards the end. It's an extra step that we don't need, so don't simplify it. That one doesn't simplify anyway because there's a variable on top, but if it's two numbers and it could simplify, don't. Just write it out. Okay? Let's look at example 2. Same idea here. Step 1, we're going to label. So I circle my angle. I label the sides I have in relation to it. Well, my x is next to this, so that's my adjacent side. And then my hypotenuse is over here because that's where my right angle is pointing, so the h. Step 2 is to determine that trig function. Well, I have a and h, that means I'm going to use cosine. Okay? 3 is to write out our equation. So we write out the trig function first. Cosine, we determined that from what we had in our problem. We do our angle next, and then we write out our ratio, which is a over h for cosine, so x over 26. And that's where we stop. Okay? Example 3, same process here. Circle the angle, label your sides. Well, 25 is across from it, over on the other side, so it's the opposite, and then the x is adjacent to it. Over here on my hypotenuse, I have nothing. Where the right angle points, I have no value. That tells me, since it's O and A, I'm going to use tangent. Now I'm going to write my trig equation. Tangent of 72 equals 25 over x, the O over the A. Okay? Now in Schoology, I'm writing this out, the O over the A, the O over the H, the A over the H to the side. I don't need to see that in Schoology. I'm not asking for it. So don't write that. That's just helping us here set up that ratio. This is the ratio that I want in Schoology. Alright, next example. Same process here. Circle the angle, label your sides. Well, I have the opposite side and the hypotenuse. Hypotenuse because that's where my right angle is pointing. Opposite because it's over on the other side of the triangle. Since it's O and H, that tells me it's sine. So I have sine of 33 equals 15 over x. And there is my answer. Okay? Next one. Now notice this one's different. My angle is where the variable is. In my head, and we'll talk more about this in the next video, in the next lesson, in my head I should be realizing, well, I'm finding an angle, I'm going to use the inverse function. I'm not going to worry about that when I set up the equation. I worry about that when I actually solve it. Okay? So, I'm going to label my sides, just like I normally would. I have the adjacent and the hypotenuse. So it's next to it, and then where the right angle is pointing. So that A and H tells me I'm going to use cosine. Cosine of x equals adjacent over hypotenuse, 18 over 23. Now this is an example of where I do not want you to simplify that fraction. This one doesn't simplify anyway, but you have two numbers, and if they could, I don't want you to do it. Okay? So this is what I would expect in Schoology. Trig function, angle, ratio. Okay? Last example here, and then a quick recap. So, circle my angle, label my sides. I have the opposite and the hypotenuse. That tells me it is sine. The sine of my angle on this one is x equals 40, the opposite, over 41, the hypotenuse. And there we're finished. Okay, it's that easy today. You're just plugging in what you can determine from the triangle, and it has to be in that form. The trig function, the angle equals the ratio as a fraction. Okay, so quick recap here. Today, we're just setting up equations. We're going to solve them next week in the next video. So don't get too far ahead. If you want to, you're more than welcome to Google it and start looking at what you could do. But we're going to tie all the last 3 videos together in the next one, okay, when we start solving. Okay, remember step 1 is to determine what you have. Step 2 is to determine your trig function. And then step 3 is to write your equation where it's the function, the angle equals your ratio as a fraction. Okay, now this last part here, just a little bit of looking forward. Okay, I'm going to plant this idea in your head, hopefully it'll marinate between now and then. But looking forward, there are 3 types of problems when we're doing these trig problems. And when I say that to people, their brain automatically goes, that's true, there are sine, cosine, and tangent problems. That is not what I'm talking about. Okay, the 3 types of problems, and if you can realize this, it'll help you when we're solving them. Okay, I actually gave them to you. They were the 6 examples we did. Okay, it's where your variable is located. That's how we tell what type of problem we have. You can have the variable on top of your ratio. That's type 1. And if we look back here, that is example number 1. My variable was on top of my ratio. And example number 2, my variable was on top of my ratio. Okay, that is this one here. Okay, variable on top. Example 2, variable on the bottom. Okay, if we look, that's this one. My variable is on the bottom here of my ratio. On the bottom of the ratio in the next example. So example 3 and 4. That's variable on the bottom. And then example 3, and I pointed this one out, it's the variable as your angle. Okay? Those are the 3 types of problems we're going to look at. And if we, like I said, if we realize that those are the 3, and not sine, cosine, tangent, okay, those are interchangeable with these 3 types. Those are just the functions we're using. If you recognize that it's where the variable is located, it's going to help you solve them quite a bit. Okay? So again, that's just a little bit of looking forward into the next video, and I'll recap all of that in the next video when we start talking about it. You do have a Schoology assignment. Most of it is just setting up those trig equations or which one you would use, so don't freak out about it. I think it's a very simple assignment if you recognize what's going on. Okay? If you can label them correctly. If you can't do that, I'd go back and watch or redo your first set of the trig videos, which is homework number 9. I would do that one, and then move on from there, kind of recap it. Otherwise, you have a Schoology assignment. If you have questions, feel free to email me or put a post in the discussion board. Good luck.